Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, Hypertrophy Concepts and Tools, Lecture 19, Counting Volumes. I know tons of you couldn't wait for this lecture. Sorry it had to be 19th, just the sequence in which it occurs in the hypertrophy book. As far as a relevant topic, how do we count training volumes? What is this all about? So first of all, why count volumes at all? Some good reasons there. Why we're going to count sets versus other ways of counting volumes. We're going to talk about counting per session versus per week. Big difference. So we have to be very clear on how we count. Because, people say, what's your MRV? 10 sets. Was it 10 sets per session or 10 sets per week? Two potentially very different numbers there. Then we're going to talk about counting compound exercises with multiple muscles in them as to which muscle to count. Is bench pressing counted towards tricep hypertrophy or towards pec hypertrophy? Who knows? We have 3 different methods, all with their pluses and minuses, to analyze which one to use. We're going to talk about counting different training methods, like, for example, drop sets versus myoreps versus supersets versus straight sets. Interesting. Do we count all those as regular sets? Maybe, maybe not. And then lastly, we're going to talk about counting consistency, which is incredibly important, and counting simplicity, which might have some really, really big benefits. So let's get into it. Why do we count volumes? Super short discussion here. For best results, it's obvious to you folks by now, you have to know your rough maintenance volume, minimum effective volume, maximum recoverable volume at the very least. If you just don't know how much volume you're doing, you're off to a real bad start. It's like not knowing how much weight you're using at the gym. You wouldn't make that mistake. That's kind of ridiculous. For progression week to week, volume is an important factor, right? If you just do some training on this Monday and the next Monday, you're like, I need to do a little more. How do you know how much you did this Monday if you're not counting at least the number of sets you're doing, possibly reps, so on and so forth? And, if you are counting your volume in no way at all, then you actually won't even be able to know if you're hitting your volume landmarks or if they're in line. Someone can say, are you sure you're training enough on this fat loss phase to conserve muscle? And you're like, well, yeah. And you're like, how do you know that? Well, I'm doing enough volume. And you're like, okay, how much volume are you doing? And how much do you usually need to maintain? And you're like, huge blank look on your face. Not a good thing, right? You won't be able to ensure progression over weeks because progression involves sometimes raising volume and you have to sort of meticulously raise it to a certain extent. So for example, if last week something like, I think 4, I wasn't tracking sets of leg press, I think I did, and I got not sore enough in my quads at all. And I felt really refreshed and I know it's not enough. How many sets am I going to do, this week? Well, if you don't have a notebook to look at that says 4 sets last week, you might do 8 sets this week because you're more. And instead of doing 5 or 6, you do 8 and your quads get super duper sore. You get way too much damage. You don't grow hardly at all. And you pissed away another week of training. Now, that's really dumb, right? So volume matters and counting it matters quite a bit, which is why we're here having this lecture. Next point. Why sets count. The number of hard sets you're doing count versus 2 other methods. First method is what we have termed mathematical volume. It's just sets times reps times weight and hypothetically times distance as well. It's the amount of mechanical work you're doing. It is absolutely the most accurate way to count volume. That's its upside because gee whiz, it tells you all the information you'll ever need to know. However, it's the least predictive of stimulus or fatigue. Here's a really, really good example. If you do a set of 5 close to failure, your mathematical volume is very low. If you do a set of 30 close to failure, your mathematical volume is fucking enormous. It's like 5 times bigger, or at least 4 times bigger. Right? Because it's less weight, but not by that much. And it's way more reps than it is less weight. So if you just multiply sets, reps, weight, then you just set is 1, reps and weight, distance is the same exercise. It really makes it seem like higher rep sets are way more volume, and they are, but that's not predictive of stimulus because sets of 5 and sets of 30 have roughly the same hypertrophic stimulus. And it's not predictive of fatigue because sometimes they have similar fatigue and sometimes they don't, depending on the exercise, depending on the movement, depending on the person, so on and so forth. So mathematical volume is really cool if you're a super perfectionist who wants to collect data that goes nowhere, but it really doesn't tell us a whole lot about what's going on, unfortunately. It would be great if we could use it, but it's just not super useful in hypertrophy training. What about effective reps counting? Effective reps counting The definition here is you count only the reps in the set that are north of 5 reps in reserve. So if you have a set that ends at 2 RIR, and then, it's a set of 10, then that means you have 3 effective reps because it's, 5, 4, 3, and then you stopped, and then that's it. Okay. So that's 3 effective reps. And then let's say you do 6 or 7 more sets just like that. And, it's 6 times 3, or like roughly 18 to 20 effective reps that you did through that whole workout. So only counting effective reps. This is under the presumption that effective reps are the only ones that matter for 2 things: stimulus, which is a decent argument, not the best, and fatigue, which is total bullshit because all reps matter for fatigue. If you had to do a bunch of ineffective reps and versus a program that only effective reps, certainly the ineffective reps program, in addition to that, would be more fatigue, but automatically we know that this is not going somewhere really good. The upside here is that it's more applicable than mathematical volume, right? At least the effective reps counting would say that 30 RM and a 5 RM, as previously mentioned, which in mathematical volume predicts nothing, at least it'll give you a pretty good stimulus to fatigue ratio estimate between the two, right? Very, very comparable. However, it's not accurate because the reps that lead into the effective reps are also both stimulative and fatiguing, and we miss those entirely. And you get really, really weird conclusions. For example, if you have a set of 0 reps in reserve, that's 5 effective reps. And if you do 2 sets that stop 2 or 3 reps in reserve, that's also 5 effective reps. If you count stimulus and fatigue in that way, you're essentially saying that a set at 0 RIR has just as much fatigue as 2 sets at 2 or 3 RIR, which is actually probably true. Hilariously. What about stimulus? Well, there's about 10 studies now that show that if you stop people at roughly 2 to 3 reps in reserve, that per set, they get essentially almost the same or sometimes even higher hypertrophy than a set truly to failure. But you predicted that it was going to take 2 sets of 2 or 3 RR to get the same as 1 set of 0 RR for hypertrophy. And that's just wrong by a factor of 2, right? So all of a sudden the stimulus calculations are way, way, way off. And if you count only with effective reps, you're automatically biasing yourself to go way too close to failure all the time, which is not effective maximally and just not necessary. And it wildly throws off your calculations, right? Lastly, the best way to count volume is by the number of working sets. This was established by a few researchers a few years ago, popularized by the great Greg Nuckols. And it really is an awesome way to count. You just count the number of sets that are working sets that are essentially 5 RR or less, and you treat them roughly as equivalent, right? So if you did 5 sets, that's, count 5 sets as your volume. If you did 6 sets is your volume. It's okay if some of those were slightly different RRs or slightly different exercises. It's working sets are working sets, and for the muscle, they target roughly similar amounts of hypertrophy. Definitely the most applicable. It most accurately proxies stimulus and fatigue, which is why we're going to use it. The downsides here, I really wouldn't call it downsides because the other methods don't even address this, is a complexity is how do we address supersets, drop sets, etc. Are they just regular sets, right? So like how many sets? When you say you do skull crushers to close grip bench superset, is that 2 sets for triceps or 1 set? Not sure, but we'll figure that out later. So let's take a look at how this evolves. Before we take a look at in-depth counting sets for various modalities, we got to get this out of the way. Counting has to be very specific to per session or per week. Okay, when you count sets, it's important to be specific about the frequency. For example, you can say my MRV is 20 sets for chest, but that doesn't mean a whole lot because someone can ask, okay, is that over 2 sessions or 4 sessions? Because it seems to be that to a point, adding frequency increases your MRV, right? So if you train chest, and this has been very well demonstrated in at least 2 studies from Brazil now, where you have training just once a week, MRV, certainly MAV, maximum adaptive volume, seems to be somewhere between 5 and 10 sets per session. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, it's over the course of 20 weeks without a deload, so you could say in shorter bursts you could do more, but let's say 10 sets. Right? 10 sets per session is close to your MRV, very close to your MAV. With 1 session of chest per week. But what about with 2? We have a bunch of data that says with 2, it's something like 15 to 20. We have some very good data from various other studies. The most famous one is the the Schoenfeld and Krieger study and the studies from Brazil that it replicated is that when you go to 3 sessions, you get even more MRV. Now, this is slightly less effective per set training, so there is some leeway to that, but definitely the volumes changed. You can't tell someone like, hey, MRV is 40 sets for chest. And they're like, what? That's crazy. Do 40 sets in one workout? You're like, no, it's over 5 workouts. And all of a sudden, like, that just doesn't sound that crazy. That's like 8 sets a workout. That seems reasonable. You have to be specific. So you don't want to say my MRV is 20 sets for chest necessarily. You want to say when I do 2 sessions a week, my chest MRV is 20, right? And when you refer to your volume landmarks, you probably want to do this per session or per week, and you always want to have a frequency. So saying my MRV is 20 sets per week doesn't mean a whole lot, but it means something, but it could mean more. You say, my MRV when I train chest 3 times a week is 25 sets. When I train twice a week, it's 20 sets, and once a week, it's 15. That makes a lot more sense. So it's a really good idea to have that session and frequency pinned down. All right. So we're going to count sets. We're going to count working sets. We're not going to do mathematical volume. We're not going to do effective rep counting. How are we going to do it? Okay. First of all, counting isolation exercises is easy. Okay. Like in one set of tricep extensions is one fucking set of tricep extensions. No problem. The complexities come in counting compounds. Okay. Is a close grip bench 1 set for chest? Kind of, except if you tuck your elbows a lot, your chest is less active than it would be in a wide grip bench. So if you're saying, okay, I'm doing close grip this week on Monday, and then this week on Wednesday, I'm doing wide grip, like how many sets of chest do I count? Is one more than the other? Because my chest gets more sore and more pumped with the wide grip and less sore and less pumped with the close grip. So if I count them both as one, that's sort of something is being lost in translation, right? But on the other hand, somebody could ask, well, what about triceps, right? 1 set of close grip bench, is that 1 set for triceps? Like sort of. Again, hit your tricep pretty well, but skull crushers hit your triceps more directly. So they're for sure a 1. And can we say, someone can say like, man, I need 10 sets of triceps to get remotely sore. And you're like, fuck, you need 10 sets of skull crushers to get sore? And they're like, no. I just do wide grip dips and incline dumbbell press, but it uses my triceps. And you're like, man, that's not really tricep training though. Like it sort of is. There's a lot lost in that. What about front delts? Is front delt training a third? Do we count 1/3 when we do close grip bench, right? Front delts and dips. I mean, they're involved sort of, but not a ton. Like I get it. Front delts and overhead presses. Sure. Fine. 1-to-1. What about, when they help exercises where they're not a ton involved? Here's a really good one. In chest flies, what do we count front delt volume as? Because in chest flies, if you ever feel your front delts, they're active at least to some extent, but it's not maximum. So if we say like chest flies, 1 for chest, 1 for biceps because they're flexing the whole time, 1 for forearms because I'm holding the weight, and 1 for front delts, you're going to have a program where you supposedly do 40 sets for front delts, but your delts aren't growing and they're never sore and they're never tired and they're never getting beat up. And you're like, well, 40 sets, that's crazy. Well, those aren't real sets, right? So we're into some shit. We're definitely into a problem. We have a few options as to how to get out of it, how to have some consistency. Method number 1 is average method of complexity. The next method we're going to look at is very complex, and the one after that is very simple. Average complexity method. Method 1, count all target muscles as 1 set. So for example, in the bench press, your pecs count as getting 1 set per set of bench. Easy. And then you count all main synergists as half set. Main synergist for your pecs includes your front delts. Okay. They definitely contribute a lot for the wide grip bench, or just regular grip bench. So we count them as half a set, right? So if you do 4 sets of a regular grip bench, we count that as 2 sets for front delts. If you're going to do set counting very precisely, that's how you'd count them. And then for triceps, they're also a major contributor, right? If you pull your tricep off the bone, if you have a tricep injury, you're not doing any kind of benching, right? Clearly that's going to be a thing. So, whereas if you pull your calf, you can do all the benching you want because it doesn't interfere at all, right? It's not involved. So it's involved significantly. We call it a major synergist or a main synergist. And then, we count it as half. So if you do, again, 4 sets of regular bench, that's 4 sets for pecs, 2 sets for front delts, like we mentioned, and 2 sets for triceps. It makes some sense. It makes some sense. And then what about minor synergists and stabilizers, right? Like, so for example, if you're doing, high bar squatting, what do we count like the lower back? Well, man, does your lower back ever really get sore from high bar squatting? Like, no, it does from deadlifting, but not from squatting. But can we say that it's just not active at all? Like, no, it's a thing. And if you do like 50 sets of squats throughout the week, your back will fucking pay the price and you will have to reduce your deadlift volume, roll volume, so on and so forth. So but that's a minor synergist / stabilizer. In this average method, we're just not going to count it. Does that miss some details? Yes. So maybe we want a more advanced count. Let's get on to method number 2. Method 2 counts all involved muscles somehow. Here we go, folks. Again, not advocating this, just showing you the lay of the land. Count all the involved muscles. Prime movers are 1 set per set. Easy, straightforward count. When we do in bench, we count, let's do another exercise just for shits and giggles. When we're doing overhead tricep extension, 1-to-1 triceps, for sure. Okay, great. Major synergists are at 2/3 rep per set. So when you do overhead extensions, this last lockout part definitely uses your front delt significantly. So we're going to say that's 2/3. So if you do 3 sets of overhead tricep extensions, we count that as 2 sets of main front delt work. Okay, makes some sense. Minor synergists at 1/2 a set per set, right? So a minor synergist in this case might be your lats, especially if you're doing them back this way, right? Because it takes your lats to pull your arm back. Or let's say we're doing a skull crusher, but we're doing it back here. Okay, definitely triceps, but you actually do have to use your lats quite a bit to return the bar. I mean, are they getting the work out of their life? No. So we only give them 1/2 a set per set. So 4 of these kinds of skull crushers, and you get 2 sets to your lats. It's not unreasonable, right? And then stabilizers, unless they have a really big raw stimulus magnitude or fatigue exposure, like for example, technically the spinal erectors are a stabilizer for the deadlift in the sense that they don't move, but they produce force. They're, as far as we're going to count them, they're 1-to-1 for the deadlift, right? So unless they're doing a ton of work, the stabilizers are going to count as 1/3 per set. Example, your forearms, or your forearm musculature in your overhead, behind the neck, laying down tricep thing. It's going to count for 1/3 of a set. So if you do, 3 sets of these triceps, it counts as 1 set of forearms, which funny enough, some of you may be putting this together right now. How come so few people train their forearms directly? Well, because this has some merit. Where would forearms and your muscles that grip, where would they rank on rows, curls, triceps, bench? Every fucking exercise gives them 1/3 of an effect per set. So what's their MRV? Well, probably it's really, really high because they're very high endurance muscles. They're used to moving all the time and they're relatively small. They don't take on a ton of damage. So we can hypothesize their MRV in relatively well-trained people is something like 40 sets. Be like 40 sets, but I've done 0 sets of those last week and my forearms are fucking big and they've been growing my entire training career. I've never done forearms on their own. Well, here's the thing. If you count with fractional counting like this to reflect the most deep reality of what's going on from a stimulus perspective and a fatigue perspective, that's a lot of 1/3 adding up. Every row, every pull down, every curl, every extension, everything trains your grip 1/3. When you do like 100 or 120, here's your number, you do 120 sets per week for all your muscles, and all of your muscles you use a grip on, even squats, right? Then all of a sudden, shazam, you're down to 40, 1/3 of 120, 40 sets. Boom, there's your grip MRV, right? So it makes some sense that this stuff is as deep as it gets, right? This is the most very, very precise way to count. And you can do a variation here, but this is a very, very precise, the most precise way we're going to talk about. Now, here's the deal. With these numbers, what's a prime mover? What's a major synergist? What's a minor synergist? What's a stabilizer? Remember, we talked about spinal erectors as technically, from a biomechanics perspective, a stabilizer, but in the deadlift, it takes such a huge force and have to produce so much tension that they count 1-to-1. You have to use autoregulation in your counting. So if you noted, okay, in the close grip bench, the pecs are going to be a major synergist and count for 2/3, but you do 3 sets of close grip bench, your triceps don't get sore, but your pecs get notably sore. Looks like triceps are counting 2/3 and your pecs are counting as 1. You say, well, I don't do close grip bench for my pecs. Doesn't matter what you say. The physiological realities matter. Now, maybe you should close your grip a little more, but maybe that's not even possible. Then for you, based on your body design and how you execute the movement and a bunch of other differences, maybe your pecs are not as strong as your triceps, so on and so forth. For you, the close grip bench is more a chest exercise than a tricep exercise. How do you know that? How much disruption is caused to the target muscle, how much of a pump, how much perception. Like, you can even do it during training. You're close grip benching, and every time you close grip bench, you just feel tons of tension in your pecs, and you're like, okay, and you rack the weight, and someone's like, tricep day, right? And you're like, yeah, tricep day. Couldn't feel my triceps at all. No pump, no tension perception. You get skull crushers, hell yeah. But a triceps, man, maybe 2/3, maybe a half. So if you're gonna take the time to be this precise, make sure to auto-regulate correctly to rank body parts or muscle groups on how they actually respond, how much damage they actually take versus some hypothetical idea. Folks, here's why. You'll see this is going to be hilarious inside joke between the people that watch this video and myself and everyone else on my Instagram. People on Instagram ask me all the time, how many sets for lats does the bent row count? Because it's not the big stretch up here like pull-ups. Is it half or whatever? The real answer is only that person knows that based on how they do the bent row, based on their own muscle architecture, own muscle strengths and weaknesses. All I say is, listen, how bad does it mess up your lats? How much of a pump do you get? So on and so forth. And if you're like, man, like bent rows hit my lats as hard as anything else, bro, it's 1-to-1. Easy. But if like, man, I can barely feel my lats, and honestly, I can do a controlling bent rows and get like barely sore in my lats. Yeah, you're looking at like a half or maybe even a third. Who knows, right? So you got to use your own auto-regulation here, your own wisdom. You can have predicted this next point I'm going to make. This is incredibly laborious, but potentially very precise. However, it's not clear that this is accurate. Remember, precision, if you have a bullseye analogy, precision doesn't mean you throw the darts in the middle of the bullseye. It means wherever you throw them, you're throwing them at the exact same place every time. So this set counting could get you a very precise small group estimate of exactly how much volume you're doing. But does it actually reflect on where the bullseye is? Does it actually reflect how, on average, are you in the right way of estimating volumes? Maybe not. Accuracy is the average of all your dart hits. So funny enough, if you throw a dart up here, dart up there, dart here, dart there, 100 darts later, we average all of your locations and they're right in the bullseye, you have perfect accuracy. But your precision sucks. Or ideally, you'd have perfect accuracy and precision, you'd be bullseye every single time. But if you're training and there's tons of confounders, for example, exercises change. Like, you know exactly that you did 57 sets of chest, last mesocycle. And you know exactly that this mesocycle, you need 57 sets of chest to stimulate the same way. But hold on a second. You did a bunch of machine presses last meso, and this time you're doing barbell presses. So you're saying 57, but the stimulus is different. Different exercises stimulate differently. So you're incredibly precise. It's 57. But that number doesn't mean as much as you think it means. If you zoomed out a little bit and used a method that's very accurate but not as precise, you could have literally the same accuracy, the same success in your program without having to count super, super in depth, right? So that's definitely a downside, which takes us to our last potential method, which is method 3. And that's where you only count prime movers / the highest raw stimulus and fatigued muscles. And you only count one muscle per movement, sometimes 2. What's an example of this? So, close grip bench. You do it, hits your triceps pretty well, hits your pecs a little bit, triceps, 1. Easy on the isolations, but on the compounds, here's another example. Squats, high bar. Do your glutes get hit? Yeah, but they also get hit a little bit on bent rows. They get hit a little bit on deadlifts. They get hit on a bunch of stuff. No more on those exercises or less than they do in your squats. What really gets hit? Your quads, right? So you count 1 for your quads and 0 for anything else. People say, how much hamstring involvement do I count in my sumo deadlift? My response to them is, how sore do your hamstrings get after 10 sets of sumo deadlifts? Like, not at all. Like, well, you're really going to count it for anything? Right? Can you imagine your muscle just doesn't feel any weakness or soreness or pump or any kind of disruption? No information for us to conclude that you did anything with it. And you're counting it because biomechanically it should be contributing some small fraction? For the love of God, maybe not a great idea, right? So if we're counting just one muscle group, this could be too simple of a count. For example, if we count dips as only tricep movements, we could get into a situation where like, man, my chest MRV used to be 20 for 2 sessions, but man, this meso, it's like 15, bro. And someone's like, fuck that hot, but why? Why is your chest so tired? They're like, I don't know. And they look through your program and you're like, well, you got all these dips here. You did 8 sets of dips for triceps. And you're like, yeah, but that's not chest, that's triceps. And someone's like, does your chest get sore from those? You're like, yeah, dude, on the lower outer side and it's super weak. And the next day I'm trying to bench that's super heavy. And like, your chest works on dips, right? Like, well, but it's not the main thing. Well, no shit. It's still something, right? So Chest tracking on dips, if you use just one, maybe not. But then again, we run into another conundrum, right? If you counting, you say, okay, but you said 1 to 2. So I count my chest work. I count 1 for triceps for sure. So for dips, 1 for triceps, and fuck it, 1 for chest. But like, man, you could doing a lot of like dips and a lot of like close grip push-ups and count 1 for chest and be like, man, my chest MRV this cycle is like, for 2 sessions, it's like 30. It's like, well, not 30. You're going to have to do so many flies next time. You do 8 sets of flies and your pecs fall off. You're like, something's lost in translation. I guess the close grip benches and the dips don't really hit my pecs a full 1 set to 1 set. So you see where the problem is arising. And, a real good example for when this falls apart is like stiff-legged deadlifts. What's the muscle? What's the one muscle you're going to count? Hamstrings, for sure, right? What's the second muscle you're going to count? Let's say glutes, right? Because they're very active. Are you really going to count back as 0 for stiff-legged deadlifts? Like spinal erectors, are you fucking crazy? They get sore. You say, okay, well, we'll count spinal erectors. Are you really going to count glutes 0 on stiff-legged deadlifts? Like you're going to do a whole workout of lunges and then the next day expect your stiff-legged deadlifts to just be like, oh, there's no glute involvement. No big deal. Fuck. That's crazy, right? So definitely something missing here, but this simplicity might have a huge benefit to where it might be something you use most of the time, right? One big upside, and we'll see more about this in a couple slides, one big upside, advanced lifters especially tend to have very specialized routines where they need the most precise counting, but they design their routines, first of all, their programs, second of all, their execution, and also the way they modify exercises and actually do the exercises into a way that is very muscle specific. For example, if a regular person trying to get big trains their chest, they might use medium grip bench press and the extra tricep work is awesome for them. But a high level bodybuilder knows that he has to save his triceps for 2 days later when he trains triceps specifically. So his chest work might be flies and then wide grip bench and then wide grip deficit push-ups, which train triceps almost not at all, train the chest like crazy. A bodybuilder might do leg extensions or leg presses before squatting to pre-exhaust their quads so that glutes and all the other stuff and lower back that we normally count a little bit are just not involved anymore. And also their technique is better. When a regular person does a curl, they might do some front delts with it and some forearms and stuff. When a high-level bodybuilder does a curl, they might do it even choosing a different exercise. They might do a concentration curl, leaned over and really just isolate the shit out of their biceps. So you would say, well, more advanced lifters need this crazy precise count. Method number 2, they might actually be biased towards method number 3 because everything to them starts looking more like an isolation or is turned more into an isolation based on how they execute the exercise and with various pre-exhaust tactics. So lastly, before we get to our summary slide and sort of figure out which way to go, counting different training methods. So what are the training methods? Well, there are some, and they're detailed into, depending on when you watch this video in the soon to be released or already released hypertrophy book. Straight sets, just set, and then you rest a normal amount, and then you just do a set and rest a normal amount. Down sets, which is the same exercise, but lighter sets. Giant sets, which is when you say, I'm going to do 60 total reps and I'm going to do straight sets as many times as it takes to get to 60. And you're not worried about going super close to failure each time, but worried about mind muscle connection a bit more. Myo reps, where you rest like 5 to 10 seconds between mini sets and you keep going and going and going. Drop sets, which is a myo rep, but you reduce the load and you go a little faster. Agonist supersets. Antagonist is for general fitness, otherwise totally different topic. Agonist supersets where like you do a tricep skull crusher and then you do close grip bench, right? Same muscle, superset, and then occlusion training, right? So we have quite a bit of methods here. Surely we count straight sets with a 1-to-1 count. A set is a set. Right? But what about all the others? Well, straight sets, 1-to-1, down sets, 1-to-1, because it's still the same idea. And myo reps and drop sets. So myo reps and drop sets have very few reps in them after the first set, but all of them are so close to failure that we can probably count them 1-to-1 on both stimulus and fatigue. For sure, fatigue. And if we do any kind of counting, we have to make sure we're counting fatigue and not just stimulus. And fatigue is probably more important to count because it's easy to get a stimulus, but it's easier to do too much and get too much fatigue. So probably comfortable counting those as 1-to-1. So for example, if you do a myo rep set where you do one sort of lead in first set and you do 3 sets after, sets of 5 to 10 with 5 to 10 seconds break between each one, it's fine to count that as 4 sets. Totally fine. Because even if it's not as stimulative as 4 sets, it's going to be close. It's sure as hell going to be as fatiguing, right? Because that many failure approaches that soon beats you the fuck up. What about giant sets and occlusion sets? Well, giant sets, you never really get very close to failure. It's all about mind muscle. Those probably aren't as difficult and as fatiguing. And what about occlusion sets? Well, occlusion definitely stimulates some hypertrophy, but probably not as much as regular training because the load is so small. Probably doesn't cause nearly as much fatigue because the load is so small. So those might count like a 2/3 to 1 in both stimulus and fatigue. We have to do some averaging here because we're trying to get stimulus and fatigue in the same number. But essentially 2/3 to 1, which means that, if it takes you like 6 total sets, right? Or let's say, it takes you 6 total sets of a giant set, to get to where you're going. You probably can count that as 4 sets equivalent to straight sets because none of the sets were that stimulative or that fatiguing. Same with occlusion, right? Agonist supersets, people would say, okay, you did a set of skull crushers and a set of close grip. That should count as 2. But, it should definitely not count as just 1 because it's doing a superset's way more stimulus and fatigue than doing just 1 working set because you're going beyond failure and continuing to go in a mechanically more advantageous position. But you do involve other muscles and you do tax that muscle more. So I think somewhere between the two, 1.5 count is very good. So if you do, something like 6 supersets, agonist supersets, 6 sets of skulls to close grip bench, that probably roughly equates to about 9 sets of triceps. Think of it something like that, right? Now, this is just a guide for you to get to thinking about this. If you want a precision count, you got to individualize this based on raw stimulus magnitude and fatigue in your experience. So somebody could say, hey, a superset counts at 1.5. You do a superset and you barely feel a thing. A straight set was even better for you. Obviously, that superset doesn't count as 1.5. It counts more like 1, right? So on and so forth. You have to use autoregulation to make sure you're doing everything really good, okay? So that's how it would count in fractional counting. For method number 3, okay, so methods 1, and this is methods 1 and 2, we would do the fractional counting, right, for this kind of thing. Method 3, the simple method, everything counts as 1-to-1, okay? Superset counts as 1-to-1, and so do giant sets and so on and so forth for that simplicity factor. Let's take a look at how that plays out. So when we have an advanced method of counting like method 1 or a very advanced method of counting like method 2, why would we ever pick method 3 and the simple count? Okay. Strange, right? Because we clearly is more precise, maybe no less accurate, seems like it's worthwhile. Well, first argument as to why a simple count might be advantageous for most people. 1, raw stimulus magnitudes and fatigues are so different between exercises anyway. Okay, if you say, okay, I need 20 sets of quads per week to stimulate my quads well and stay under my MRV, someone can say, okay, is that leg extensions or squats? And you're like, shit. Well, it's probably like 15 sets of squats, but 25 sets of leg extensions. And whoever does those exercises at their expense anyway, you almost never do a program of only squats or only leg extensions. You probably do some mix of both, right? Which is to say that 20 becomes accurate again, right? So if you get super precise in counting, you're essentially pretending you know more than what you actually know, right? You're saying, okay, I need exactly this number. And someone's like, well, what about if the exercises are different? They're like, well, then I need a very, very different number. And then so why are you even collecting that data? Because it might just be useless to you, right? Second point, to muddle the picture a bit, volume landmarks, MEV, MRV, so on and so forth, change over the weeks, over diets, and over the long term, right? So if you have a general guess with a simple counting of like roughly 10 sets of chest on average per workout, per session, versus if you have a 12.5 from the super precision counting, that 10 is basically just as good as a 12.5 because the volume landmarks change over the week. Some weeks you're tired and you can do 13. So you're tired and you can do 9. Some weeks you're fresh, you can do 13. Over diet, so hypo versus hyper versus isocaloric, there could be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 even set differences in those numbers. And over time, you're like, my MRV is 12.5 for chest per session. Like it was that last mesocycle or 5 mesos ago. What is it now? And like, you're collecting an inordinate amount of data now to keep these things up to date where basically all of these things range within this range, right? They range up and down, up and down. You got this big range here that maybe is as big as about 3 to 5 sets. Your MRV is not like below 8 and it's not above 13, but can someone say it's definitely not 10? It's for sure 11? It's all in this range, right? And so because we know it's in this range, any counting that is more precise here versus there versus here versus there is really just lost in the noise. It's not enough signal and too much noise anyway. So there's definitely something to say for that. General guess is pretty much as good as we can hope for. And essentially, precision suffers from like a significant figures problem. You guys might remember from chemistry, like you calculate a temperature and you do the division, and it's like, well, it's 13.75 degrees Celsius. Okay, and then your chemistry professor asks you, okay, how accurate is the thermometer you're using? You're like, it only goes to 1 decimal place. He's like, where the fuck did you get the 0.5 from? You're like, well, that's what the math said. Like, yeah, but you're making up a number that you didn't actually measure. Like, right, okay. So you could say, well, it was 12.5 as my MRV. And someone's like, on what day? Today or yesterday? Hyper or isocaloric? Week 1 or week 3 of your meso? And all of a sudden, we got a range, right? Just like Dr. James Hoffman says all the time on the webinars, the volume landmarks are all ranges. They're not specific exact points. Theoretically, they're exact, but practically we can't know those things. So maybe if we're collecting a ton of data for that, it's not really a good idea. Here's another really awesome thing. Autoregulation within the mesocycle smooths all of this out. Like if you said, okay, I have an MEV of exactly 8.5 sets of chest or something like that, and you train chest, and because the exercises were different or whatever, you feel basically nothing, clearly you were fucking wrong. And then clearly you should probably do like 10 sets. And then when you do 10 sets, you get a bit of a burn, bit of a pump, so on and so forth. And all of a sudden you're correct now, right? And then if you don't auto-regulate, all the most precision in the world is only precise for one time. And you might even be guessing wrong that one time. But let's say you're right about 1 microcycle. Things change with microcycle. If you do auto-regulation, whatever rough guess you take is going to be altered after. But if you take a super precise guess, you only ever need it once. So you can imagine collecting all this crazy, crazy data that all it does is get you 1 set closer to precise in the first microcycle. And after that, it's all a wash anyway because autoregulation takes over. Don't bother with that. Start with a rough guess in your first microcycle, even go a little bit on the charitable side, conservative side, and then autoregulation is going to tell you everything you need to know anyway. So you don't have to collect these super, super precise data points, right? And lastly, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, most of your programs look pretty similar anyway. People say like, okay, well, dips, do they count for chest or for triceps? Well, is there a time in your program where you're not doing close grip dumbbell press, close grip bench press, dips, or close grip push-ups? You're like, no, I always have some version of that. So why the fuck are you counting it for chest? You just count your direct chest work and then just assume that you're always going to have some ancillary work from chest coming in from tricep training. It's going to happen every time. Now, it's going to happen a little more every time, a little less. But back to point 3, that's where autoregulation takes care of that, right? So you assumed a certain amount of chest work is going to get done ancillary in your first microcycle, but this time it was more wide grip dips than usual, and your chest got a little bit more sore than you thought. So you just don't increase chest volume as much in week number 2. It's a 1-week solved problem, as opposed to collecting mounds of data and still having to autoregulate, right? It's for nothing at the end of the day. So here is the last and final step. The solution here is to keep things only as complex as you can use. If you're collecting tons of fractional data, stop, okay? You have to have awareness of your SFRs. You have to track and essentially update, auto-regulate your program as, is it stimulating enough? Is it fatiguing enough for what we want? You have all the data you need every single week. And even if you count, your sets as any weird thing, you can always update it. And fundamentally, when a muscle, if you're doing close grips and you're counting as triceps, you're like, oof, this is hit my pecs a little bit. You don't have to count that, but just know for next week, like next week, should I do incline for 4 sets or 5 sets? You know what? My pecs are pretty well messed up from close grip. I'm just going to do it for 4. It's that easy. Just the general. It's all auto-regulation from there. The ultimate example of this is someone is like, is my back, 17 MRV or is my back like, 19 MRV? And you're like, I've unfortunately been through this before. We take a real long time to answer, and I sort of explain this, and they're like, okay. And they message you a week later, and they're like, hey man, look, I had to skip my workouts like this week because I had final exams. What do you think I should do? I'm like, motherfucker, you're out here skipping workouts and you worry about one set versus another. You just missed 17 fucking sets in a week. Who gives a shit if it's 17 or 19? It's now 15 because you're detrained. So you don't want to bite them off more than you can chew. If you're a super high level bodybuilder, you can use more advanced fractional counting if you want. But again, we said earlier, a lot of those folks are so in tune with what's going on and modified exercises so much that they mostly just use one-to-one anyway. If you're, any old other person, regular person just trying to get in shape, use the simplest method unless you need something more complex. Hopefully that answers some questions, folks. See you next time.